Hi, welcome back to Standing Strong for Marriages, a YouTube channel dedicated to helping people walk through marriage separation or divorce using Christian principles. Hey you guys, what is up? Hey, I'm calling in from Istanbul today, so pretty good background, I'd say. I like it. It's good. Airports are always fun. Anyway, so today I thought I would do this video after running into this guy, John from Seattle, on the last flight I was on 3 weeks ago. So John, if you see this, what's up, man? John and I got to talking. He had been through a divorce, and we were chatting about his situation. And I said to him, John, did you know? I said, did you know that God's been divorced? He was like, what? And I was telling him about the channel. I was like, yeah, man, it's kind of like an obscure thing. Probably like married Christians don't really like to talk about that part of things. And he's like, yeah. He's like, I've never heard of that. Man, you should totally do a video on that. And so I was like, yeah, I should. Basically what I have is I did a book review of David Instone Brewer's book called Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible. So I'm going to take a clip from that, and if you want to see the whole book review, I'll leave a link for that at the end of the video. Otherwise, I'll check it out and I'll check back in with you guys at the end. Okay. So chapter 3, the latter prophets, he spends a lot of time talking about the breaking of the marriage vows condemned, and he looks at these different books, Hosea, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. It says that they all show a picture of a God who divorces his bride reluctantly because his wife consistently breaks her marriage vows. And the no shame was attached to him because it wasn't his fault. It was the acts of Judah and Israel. Anyway, in the story of Hosea, this is an interesting story. If you don't know it, it's basically a man who was, who was asked to marry a prostitute, and she was unfaithful to him, and in the end, he took her back despite her unfaithfulness, and this was like a picture of God's marriage, his willingness to take back his wife being the people that he had chosen, Judah and Israel. So that's one thing they talk about, but they say that Hosea is very difficult to translate, and so again, that's you get some confusion there about what it all means and kind of what to say at the end of the day. And I just bring that up because, like I said, there is a lot of confusion and a lot of different opinions out there among Christians, and so this is part of the reason why. Hosea 9:15, it says, God says, I began to hate, i.e., divorce them, because of their wickedness and of their deeds, and he said that I will drive them out of my house, and I will love them no more. So, drive them out of my house. There was many people ended up being taken captive to either Babylon or there was an Assyrian occupation at one point, and so many people were forced either to leave their homeland against their will. And it says because of some of these things, which I'll get to in a second about the details. It says that God was forced into the divorce and he suffered it. But there's also this hope of a remarriage to a united nation of Israel and Judah together. And you can see that in Romans 11 if you've read that chapter. It talks about kind of the restoration. And he says that he pictures it would be like a relationship with a completely new wife. And it's a vision of a remarriage to a virgin and not an adulterous divorcee. So that's interesting, I think for me that gives a lot of hope as far as the work that God can do in people's lives. That seems like not possible. How can an adulterous divorcee become a virgin? But that's what it talks about. The story continues in Jeremiah. Jeremiah speaks of Judah is following the same path of idolatry that Israel followed, and that Israel had already been exiled at that point, that Judah lusted after other gods, and made alliances with other nations, and that she was shamed, and that she ended up being threatened with divorce. But yet in Jeremiah 31, it says Israel will be restored as a virgin, and Judah will be restored as her with as one nation. So maybe I don't know. That's okay. Let's just keep going. Ezekiel 23 pictures God as married. Yeah, so Israel was given over to the Assyrians. Judah was taken into captivity in Babylon. So it says some of the reasons for God's divorce to his people can be found in Ezekiel 16. There was adultery talked about in Ezekiel 23, and that the people had adopted these practices of sacrificing their children to idols, also in Ezekiel 23, which was... it, I guess, need not be said that God said, "Be fruitful and multiply." So sacrificing children to idols was kind of the opposite of that. Isaiah talks about Israel, and he says he sees them as a faithful city like Jerusalem, who became a harlot, but was not divorced, though has been forsaken. That's in has not been divorced is chapter 50, verse 1. Though has not been forsaken, chapter 54, verses 4 through 7, and to be married again, chapter 62, 4 and 5. So this is kind of what it says, just as the recap. Some of those books are quite long and they take a lot of work to work through, so I think this is much easier. Isaiah claims that God still loves them, even though they are in exile, and that was a really hard time for them. So, I think it's good to know that God still loves us, whether we're, the ones that are waiting or the ones that, are kind of away from home. You could say that no matter what our situation is, that God loves us. Okay. Malachi, that God loves his bride, in chapter 1, verses 2 through 5. That he did receive a lot of disrespect, chapter 1, verse 6 through 14, which my notes say which was a breaking of the covenant. Some of the other things that were described in chapters 2 and 3 were the breaking of the vows, the non-payment of tithes, the use of magic, adultery, perjury, oppression of employees, widows, orphans, and foreigners. Okay, so I'm just going to cap it off there. I mean, that was basically a lot of the highlights to try to get you guys the best verses. And obviously, it's a bit of a confusing story. You kind of have two sisters, two brides, two people, Israel and Judah. And maybe in one sense, he divorced one of them. In the other sense, maybe is just a separation. And you also have this weird thing where, kind of, he waited and, wow, I've really struggled with all the awful stuff that happened to those people during those times, because it was an awful picture for them for kind of a generation for those societies. But eventually, they came back. God continued to love them, continued to always care for them, and he always had this vision for the future, for restoration, for a thing of beauty. And you guys, it is a weird story, and even in a sense, I think that this story is not really over, because even if you skip to the New Testament, there's still this thing where God is kind of still pursuing people. There's still some of that's getting sorted out. You see that in Romans 11, like I mentioned before, where, he's still waiting for the Jews have kind of rejected the Christ. But he said, okay, well, then I'm going to go ahead and open the opportunity up to the non-Jewish people, the Gentiles, as they're called in the Bible. So just he opens it up to all nations, and he really has this vision for people from all over the world coming to know him, entering into this like marriage covenant relationship kind of with him. And then in the end, like I said, in Romans 11, you see that there's kind of the fulfillment, the final inbringing of a lot of the original people that were always designed to be in that. So Romans talks about that in a fig tree analogy as well. So you guys can just check it out. But that's kind of the gist. You can read all those verses, Isaiah, Malachi, Hosea is quite a story, as well as many others. But the thing that I think is really interesting is two things. One, this is a huge deal to God. And like many of us, we write a lot, we talk a lot about it because it's a huge deal. And God does the same thing. He writes multiple books through multiple prophets about this situation because it was huge. It was huge for him, and it really, it's his heart. It's his heart for his people, his heart for his bride. And when it didn't work out, it really crushed him. The other thing that I would say is that you can find God in your journey with your spouse, and maybe you didn't think that he has any knowledge of what it's like going through a divorce, but now you know he does. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.